The cry ripped through the desert dawn, sharper than a shard of glass. Silas Crow clutched at the ragged hole blooming crimson on his chest, a brutal counterpoint to the pale sunrise. Was that a baby crying? He must be delirious. Men didn't hear infant wails when they were bleeding to death alone in the God-forsaken wasteland. But there it was again, that desperate, innocent plea tearing through the stillness like a knife through his soul. He dragged himself towards the sound, each movement a searing betrayal from his own body. The Morrison gang's best shooter had found his mark 3 hours ago. Silas had taken 2 of them with him before catching lead, but the third had vanished into the rocks. Now he was dying, just as he'd always suspected. A slow, agonizing fade. The crying intensified as he rounded a cluster of sun-baked rocks. His breath hitched. Before him sat a pine coffin, small, child-sized, and emanating from within was the undeniable sound of a baby's desperate cries. Silas crumpled to his knees, his vision tunneling. The lid was ajar, and through the narrow opening, he saw a flicker of movement. A tiny hand balled into a fist, strained against the wood. Someone had condemned a living baby to die in a coffin in the middle of nowhere. With trembling hands, he forced the lid open. His heart lurched. A baby boy, no more than 6 months old, lay swaddled in a tattered blanket. The child's face was red and slick with tears, but undeniably, vibrantly alive. The baby's eyes locked onto his, and the crying abruptly ceased. But it was what Silas saw crudely etched into the inside of the coffin lid that sent a chill deeper than any desert night. There, burned into the wood in clumsy letters, was a name: Silas Crow. Someone had deliberately placed this baby in a coffin marked with his name. Someone knew he would find it. Someone wanted him to find it. The baby reached towards him with impossibly small fingers, and something snapped inside Silas's chest, a fracture that had nothing to do with the bullet ripping him apart. In 37 years of living by the gun, he'd never held a child, never wanted to, never believed he deserved to touch something so pure with hands stained by so much violence. But as the baby's cries faltered, Silas knew this child would die here if he did nothing. And so would he. 2 lives hanging by a thread in the unforgiving desert, brought together by a puppeteer he couldn't yet see. The gunslinger gently lifted the baby from the coffin. The child instantly quieted, tiny fingers latching onto his worn leather vest. For the first time in years, Silas felt something other than the familiar gnawing emptiness in his chest. But who had done this? Who knew his name? Who anticipated his path along this desolate trail after the confrontation with the Morrison gang? And what twisted mind would use a child as bait? As the sun climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows across the sand, Silas knew one thing with chilling certainty. Someone was playing a deadly game with his life, and this innocent child was the central piece. The baby's grip on his vest was surprisingly tenacious for one so small. Silas had witnessed hardened men surrender with less fight. As he held the child against his chest, he felt warmth spreading through his shirt. Not blood this time, but something different. Something he'd long since forgotten existed. But lingering here meant death for both of them. The desert sun was already unforgiving, and without water, the baby wouldn't survive 2 hours. Silas had perhaps 4 hours left before blood loss consumed him, and that was without the burden of extra weight. With the child, he'd be lucky to last one. His horse, Thunder, stood 30 yards away, skittish but loyal enough to remain nearby. The animal's ears twitched nervously as Silas approached, blood still oozing from his wound. Thunder had carried him through 6 years of gunfights and near misses, but never with a baby in tow. With agonizing effort, Silas hauled himself into the saddle, cradling the baby in his left arm. Each movement sent shards of lightning through his ribs, but the child had stopped crying completely now. Those dark, unwavering eyes just stared up at him with an expression that seemed too knowing for someone so young. As Thunder began the slow trek towards civilization, Silas's mind raced. Millbrook was 8 miles east, impossibly distant for a dying man, but there was something closer. The abandoned Hendricks place, deserted for 3 years ever since a band of Comanches took Calera and her children. If he could reach it, He might find supplies, maybe even unravel the mystery of this cruel setup. The baby made soft sounds, a subtle symphony of discomfort. Silas glanced down and realized the child was hungry. Of course he was hungry. Someone had left him to die in a coffin, and there was no telling how long he'd been out there. That's when the realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The coffin wasn't intended as a grave. It was a beacon. Someone knew his route, his timing, and that he'd be traversing this trail after dealing with the Morrisons. Someone wanted him to find this specific baby, but who and why weaponize a child? Thunder stumbled, and Silas felt his tenuous grip on consciousness begin to slip. The blood loss was accelerating faster than anticipated. He pressed his hand harder against the wound, a futile attempt to stem a raging river. The baby's eyes remained fixed on his face, as if sensing the peril they both faced. Those tiny fingers clenched at his vest with a desperate strength that belied their size. Then Silas saw it. A plume of smoke rising in the distance, not from the Hendricks place, but from somewhere beyond it. Someone had lit a fire, and it was emanating from the very direction he was headed. Someone was waiting for him. His free hand moved instinctively towards his gun, but the movement unleashed a fresh torrent of agony through his chest. If this was a trap, he was riding directly into it, burdened with a dying body and a helpless infant. But what alternative did he have? The desert would claim them both if he turned back. As thunder plodded towards the smoke, Silas couldn't shake the feeling that every step was being orchestrated, that someone knew about the baby, knew about the coffin, and knew he'd be compelled to follow this path. The question searing his mind as intensely as the bullet wound was simple. Was he saving this child? Or was this child about to get them both killed? The smoke was emanating from the Hendricks place, after all. As thunder crested the small hill, Silas spotted a figure moving around the dilapidated homestead, a woman in a faded blue dress tending a fire outside the crumbling cabin. She looked up as they approached, and Silas felt his blood run cold. He knew that face. Elena Vasquez, the woman whose husband he'd killed in a Tombstone saloon 2 years ago. The woman who'd sworn vengeance over her husband's shallow grave, promising to make Silas pay for robbing her children of their father. She was supposed to be in Mexico, evading the law after embezzling funds from the bank where she'd worked. Now she was here, in the heart of nowhere, with a fire blazing and supplies meticulously arranged as if expecting company. The baby stirred in his arms as thunder slowed to a stop 20 feet from the cabin. Elena rose slowly, her hands empty but her eyes radiating something darker and colder than hatred. She was older now, the lines of grief etched deep around her eyes, but her posture was unwavering, dangerous. "Silas Crow," she said, her voice clear and sharp, slicing through the desert air. "Right on time." "Elena," his voice rasped, rougher than he intended. "You're the one who left the baby?" "My grandson," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "Miguel's boy, born 3 months ago." The pieces clicked into place with sickening precision, like tumblers falling into alignment on a deadly lock. Miguel Vasquez, Elena's hot-headed son, the young gun who'd been riding with the Morrison gang. The third shooter who'd escaped this morning after pumping lead into Silas. "Your boy tried to kill me this morning," Silas said, instinctively tightening his grip on the baby. The child had gone completely still, as if sensing the palpable tension. "And you killed his father. Seems fair," Elena said, emotionless. She took a step closer, her hand subtly moving behind her back. "But Miguel's always been too impetuous, couldn't finish what he started. So you finished it for him, used his own baby as bait." Elena's laugh was as brittle as desert wind. "That baby's name is Diego Vasquez, not Silas Crow. You're not saving him, Gunslinger, you're delivering him." Silas felt the trap snapping shut around him, a suffocating noose. His gun hand was his right, but the baby was cradled in his left, and he was too debilitated to draw quickly enough. Elena had strategically positioned herself, close enough for conversation, far enough to react if he made a move. "The coffin," he said, the remaining pieces finally tumbling into place. "You carved my name in it." "Where dead men belong," she said. "Miguel couldn't kill you cleanly, so I thought I'd let you choose. Die here alone or die knowing you saved the child of the man you murdered. The baby, Diego, made a soft sound, and Elena's hardened expression flickered momentarily, a grandmother's love piercing through the layers of vengeance. "But here's what my impulsive boy didn't know," Elena continued, her hand still concealed behind her back. "That baby's sickly, been ailing since birth, needs medicine we can't afford. Medicine that costs more than we'll ever possess." Silas understood now. This wasn't purely about retribution, it was about desperation. "You want my money?" "I want you dead," Elena corrected, her eyes burning like embers. "But I'll settle for your money and your life insurance policy. Word is you've got a bounty on your head worth $2,000, plus whatever you're carrying." The baby's breathing seemed shallower now, and Silas could feel faint tremors coursing through the small body. Elena wasn't exaggerating about the illness. "What's wrong with him?" "Heart condition, needs surgery back east, costs more than most folks see in a lifetime." Elena's voice cracked ever so slightly, revealing the depth of her desperation. "So you're going to give me everything you have, and then you're going to die knowing you at least did one decent thing in your miserable life." But something in Elena's gaze told Silas this wouldn't conclude with mere money. She'd waited too long for this moment to simply let him walk away, even if it was a death march. The critical question was, how much time did he have before she abandoned the dialogue and started shooting? The baby's breathing became more labored in his arms. Silas could feel each tiny struggle for air, and something inside him cracked open wider than his bullet wound. This child was fading, and rapidly. Elena hadn't been lying about the severity of the heart condition. "How long does he have?" Silas asked, his voice softer than it had been in years. Elena's composure faltered, the carefully constructed mask of vengeance crumbling. "Doctor in Millbrook said weeks, maybe days, without proper care." She caught herself, biting off the words. But Silas could see the desperation bleeding through her anger, like a stain spreading on cloth. "That's why you devised this elaborate trap. You're not solely after revenge, you're attempting to save him." "Don't you dare try to paint this as some noble endeavor," Elena snapped, her voice laced with bitterness. "You shattered my family, killed my husband over $20 in a card game disagreement. This baby is dying because we can't afford to save him." Silas felt the accumulated weight of every life he'd extinguished settling on his shoulders like an avalanche of desert sand. Carlos Vasquez had been cheating at cards, undeniably. But the man had also been desperately trying to win money to feed his family, a fact Silas had known and ignored. The baby's eyes fluttered open, meeting Silas's with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. Those weren't the eyes of someone surrendering to death. They were the eyes of someone fighting with every ounce of strength they possessed. "There's a doctor in Phoenix," Elena continued, her voice cracking. "A surgeon renowned for mending hearts like Diego's, but it demands $3,000 more than my family will earn in 3 lifetimes." Silas had $4,000 secreted away in his saddlebags, the accumulated earnings from years of bounties, gunfights, and jobs that had kept him alive but had never allowed him to truly live. Blood money that had never brought anyone any real good. "You can have it all," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "Every cent. But you permit me to take him to that doctor first." Elena's hand shifted from behind her back, revealing an aged Navy Colt, her father's gun, if Silas's memory served him correctly. "You believe I'm naive enough to trust the man who murdered my husband?" "I'm dying regardless," Silas said, gesturing to the crimson stain spreading across his shirt. "I've got maybe 2 hours left, 3 if I'm fortunate. But this baby could live if we cease wasting time and get him to Phoenix. Phoenix is 40 miles, you'd never reach it in your condition. Then we go to Millbrook. Doc Harper's got rudimentary supplies. He might be able to stabilize him sufficiently for the journey." Elena's gun wavered precariously, the grandmother warring with the widow, love battling hate. "Why would you assist him after everything?" The baby emitted a faint whimper, and Silas looked down into those unwavering dark eyes once more. "Because certain things matter more than dying consumed by vengeance." For a protracted moment, the desert fell silent, broken only by the crackling fire and Diego's labored breathing. Elena's gun remained trained on Silas, but her finger had eased away from the trigger. "Miguel's lurking in Millbrook," she said at last, her voice tight with apprehension. "He sees you approaching with his boy. He'll shoot you on sight without hesitation." "Then you better accompany us and ensure he doesn't," Silas countered. Elena offered a mirthless laugh, devoid of any genuine humor. "You desire me to safeguard the man who murdered my husband? I desire you to safeguard your grandson." The baby's breathing abruptly grew more shallow, and Silas felt panic surge through him like a lightning strike. Diego's lips were acquiring a faint blue tinge, and his tiny body was going limp. "He's deteriorating," Silas said urgently. "We need to depart, immediately." Elena witnessed it as well. Her gun dipped as she stepped forward, reaching for her grandson. But as her hands brushed against the baby, Diego's breathing seemed to steady ever so slightly, as if merely being near his family infused him with the resilience to persevere a little longer. "There's a wagon positioned behind the cabin," Elena said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Miguel transported supplies anticipating we'd require them after. Hitch it, quickly." But as Elena hurried towards the cabin, Silas heard something that froze his blood despite his fading strength. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses riding hard and approaching rapidly. Miguel hadn't been waiting in Millbrook after all. He was coming here, and he was bringing company. 3 riders crested the ridge, moving at breakneck speed, leaving trails of dust billowing in their wake. Miguel Vasquez rode in the lead, his face contorted with unadulterated rage, visible even from a distance. The 2 men flanking him were Morrison gang survivors, the kind of men who'd shoot first and never bother with questions. Elena heard them as well and froze halfway to the wagon. "Miguel, no!" she screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the thunder of approaching hooves. Silas had mere seconds to make a decision that would dictate whether the baby lived or perished. He could attempt to draw his gun one-handed while cradling Diego, but he was weakened by blood loss and would likely miss. He could hand the baby to Elena and attempt to fight, but that would leave the child vulnerable to the crossfire. Or he could resort to something that defied every survival instinct he'd honed over 37 years. He could surrender. "Elena," he called out, his voice surprisingly firm. "Take him!" She rushed back as the riders thundered into the clearing. Silas meticulously transferred Diego into his grandmother's arms. The baby's breathing was now so faint it was almost imperceptible. Elena's eyes welled with tears as she felt the limpness of her grandson. Miguel's horse skidded to a halt, his gun drawn before the dust even settled. His face was a mirror image of his father's, the same dark eyes, the same stubborn jaw, but where Carlos had radiated desperation, Miguel emanated pure fury. "Keep away from him, Mama!" Miguel bellowed, his gun trained on Silas. "Keep away from that baby killer!" "Miguel, cease this!" Elena stepped between her son and Silas, Diego cradled protectively in her arms. "He was trying to help, to assist." Miguel's voice cracked with disbelief. "He murdered Papa! He's the reason Diego's dying!" The other 2 riders dispersed, flanking the scene. Silas recognized them now. Pete Morrison and his cousin Jake, ruthless men who'd been involved in cattle rustling and bank robberies across 3 territories. They'd exploit Miguel's grief for their own malicious purposes without a second thought. "The boy speaks truth," Pete said, his gun also drawn. "Crow's got a bounty on his head worth more than this baby's medicine. We eliminate him here, gather the money, everyone profits except Diego." Silas spoke quietly, his hands raised in surrender but his eyes locked on Miguel. "Your boy requires that doctor in Phoenix. You kill me now, you'll never accumulate enough money to save him." Miguel's gun wavered momentarily. "You're lying!" $4,000 in my saddlebags, more than adequate for the surgery, but only if we transport him to a doctor within the next few hours. Elena clutched Diego tighter, the baby's breathing growing more erratic. "Miguel, listen to him! Diego's deteriorating!" "After what he inflicted upon Papa..." Miguel's voice broke, revealing the agonizing conflict raging within him. "You expect me to trust him? I expect you to save your son." The standoff stretched, taut as a frayed wire about to snap. 4 guns drawn, a dying man, a dying baby, and a family torn asunder by justice and love. The desert sun continued its ascent, each passing minute robbing Diego of precious time. Pete Morrison spat in the dust, his impatience palpable. "Enough prattling. We rode out here to collect a bounty, not to listen to sentimental stories. But Jake Morrison was gazing intently at the baby in Elena's arms, and something in his expression had shifted. "Pete," he said softly, his voice laced with uncertainty, "that baby appears genuinely ill." "So?" Pete sneered. "So, I have a child too back in Colorado." The admission hung in the air, heavy as the impending storm. Silas recognized this as his critical moment, a crack in their resolve that he could potentially exploit. "Then you understand," Silas said to Jake, his voice strained but sincere, "witnessing your child suffer and being powerless to alleviate their pain." Miguel's gun began to tremble. Behind him, Pete Morrison grew increasingly agitated, his finger tightening on the trigger. If Miguel didn't make a decision within the next few seconds, Pete Morrison wasn't going to wait any longer for an answer. Pete Morrison's patience finally snapped like a parched twig. "Jake, what ails you? We didn't ride out here to play nursemaid to some expiring infant." "Perhaps we should hear him out," Jake said, his voice wavering, but his gun remaining raised. "Hear him out?" Pete's gun swung menacingly towards his own cousin. "The man has a $2,000 bounty on his head and you propose engaging in polite conversation?" Miguel's face became a battleground of warring emotions, the simmering rage at his father's killer clashing with the overwhelming desperation to save his son. Elena observed her grandson's breathing become shallower with each passing second, her own tears finally breaking free. "Miguel," Elena whispered urgently, "Diego doesn't possess the luxury of time for this." The baby's lips were undeniably blue now, and his tiny chest barely rose and fell. Silas had witnessed enough death to recognize its approach, and this child was rapidly losing the fight. "The wagon," Silas said to Miguel, his voice steady despite the blood loss making him sway in the saddle. "Hitch it up. We can debate my bounty after we save your boy." "Don't heed him!" Pete shouted, his gun swinging back toward Silas. "He's attempting to escape!" "Where am I planning to escape to?" Silas gestured to the blood saturating his shirt. "I'm dying regardless, but that baby doesn't have to join me." Miguel's gun dipped slightly. For a fleeting moment, Silas believed the young father might choose his son over vengeance, but Pete Morrison had alternative plans brewing. "Very well," Pete said, his gun abruptly swinging back toward Silas. "We'll collect the bounty now and determine the baby's fate later." The shot echoed across the desert like a thunderclap, but it wasn't Pete's gun that had discharged. Jake Morrison had fired a bullet into his cousin's shoulder, sending Pete spinning to the ground with a string of curses that could be heard miles away. "Jake!" Pete gasped, clutching at his wounded arm. "What in damnation?" "I warned you," Jake said quietly, his smoking gun still clutched in his hand. "I have a child too." The sudden eruption of violence shattered Miguel's paralysis. He holstered his gun and rushed to Elena, gently taking Diego from her arms. The baby was so still now that for a terrifying instant, Silas feared they were too late. "He's still breathing," Miguel said, his voice trembling. "Barely, but he's still fighting." Elena was already sprinting towards the cabin. "The wagon is ready. Miguel aided me in preparing him in the back." But Pete Morrison hadn't resigned himself to defeat. Despite his wounded shoulder, he was attempting to reach for his gun with his good hand, his face contorted with fury and greed. Silas witnessed it unfolding and made his decision. With the last vestiges of his strength, he drew his own gun and fired a bullet into the ground inches from Pete's functioning hand. "The next one won't miss," Silas said, although the exertion of drawing his weapon had nearly caused him to lose consciousness. Pete glared up at him, his eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. "This isn't over, Crow." "Yes, it is." Jake Morrison dismounted and assisted his wounded cousin to his feet. "Pete, we're departing now. You're committing a mistake." "Jake, perhaps—" Jake swallowed hard, glancing at Diego cradled in Miguel's arms. "But I can reside with this mistake." As the Morrison cousins rode away, Pete still spewing curses and vowing retribution, Silas felt his remaining strength desert him entirely. He slumped forward in his saddle, only Thunder's unwavering stance preventing him from falling to the ground. "Miguel," Elena called from the wagon. "We need to depart, now." Miguel looked back and forth between his fading son and the man who had murdered his father. The choice that had seemed utterly impossible mere moments ago now presented itself with stark clarity. "Help me convey him into the wagon," Miguel said to his mother. Elena's eyes widened in surprise. You mean he's accompanying us? Diego requires that money. And Crow's the sole one who knows its location. As they carefully transferred Silas from his horse to the wagon bed, the gunslinger experienced something he hadn't felt in years. Not absolution, that would demand more time than he had left. But something in its proximity, a chance to expire for something transcending pride or money. Diego lay beside him in the wagon, both of them battling for each and every breath. But as Elena climbed onto the driver's seat and Miguel mounted his horse to ride alongside, Silas permitted himself one small glimmer of hope. Perhaps this baby would survive. Perhaps some good could arise from all the blood he had spilled. But they still needed to reach Millbrook alive, and the desert wasn't finished testing them. The wagon wheels churned against the unforgiving desert hardpan as Elena urged the horses onward, driving them harder than they should have been pushed. Each jarring bump sent fresh surges of torment through Silas's chest, but he suppressed any outward expressions of discomfort. Adjacent to him, Diego's breathing had become so shallow that it was almost impossible to discern. Miguel rode alongside the wagon, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, acutely aware that Pete Morrison may have retreated, but that men like him didn't relinquish $2,000 bounties willingly. They would return, undoubtedly with reinforcements. "How much farther?" Elena called out, her voice barely audible above the din of the churning wheels. 3 miles, Miguel responded, but his tone betrayed his uncertainty. 3 miles was still an insurmountable distance for either of the rapidly fading passengers in the wagon. Silas reached into his vest pocket with trembling fingers and extracted a small leather pouch. Inside lay a cache of pills that Doc Harper had prescribed months earlier for pain management, laudanum-based, potent enough to induce a permanent slumber if ingested in excessive quantities, but potentially capable of buying Diego the time he desperately needed. "Elena," he called out weakly, his voice raspy, "halt the wagon. We cannot stop. Diego's declining rapidly. That's why we must stop," Silas persisted. Elena reluctantly pulled on the reins, bringing the horses to a protesting halt. Miguel dismounted swiftly, his face etched with the torment of witnessing his son slipping away minute by minute. Silas held up the pouch, displaying its contents. Pain medication, potent. It may slow down his heart rate, lessen his oxygen requirement. Miguel's eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding his gaze. "You propose drugging my baby?" "I propose sustaining him long enough to reach the doctor," Silas countered, his voice growing weaker, yet his conviction remained steadfast. "It is a risky proposition, but inaction guarantees certain demise." Elena clambered into the wagon bed and examined her grandson. Diego's lips were bordering on purple now, and his tiny fingers had grown limp. She'd witnessed her husband succumb to death, and she recognized its telltale signs. "What is the dosage?" she inquired of Silas. "A quarter of a pill, dissolved in water, might secure us an hour, perhaps 2. Miguel's hands trembled as he accepted the pouch. "What if it kills him? What if it saves him?" The young father locked his gaze on the pills, then back to his son. It was a gamble with stakes of the highest order. His child's life. "Miguel," Elena said softly, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "Your papa always said sometimes you have to gamble everything in order to safeguard what you value most." Miguel's eyes welled with tears as he carefully broke off a quarter of one pill. Elena produced a small canteen, and together they dissolved the fragment with as much precision as their trembling hands could muster. Administering the medicine to Diego required a level of patience they simply didn't possess. The baby was so debilitated that he could barely swallow, and each passing second of delay propelled him closer to the precipice of death. But finally, they managed to coax the dissolved medicine down his throat. Within a matter of minutes, Diego's breathing seemed to stabilize subtly, neither markedly improved nor noticeably worsened. "It is working," Elena whispered, a glimmer of hope flickering in her eyes. Miguel remounted his horse, his face reflecting the conflicting emotions of hope and trepidation. "Let's proceed." But as Elena snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, Silas heard something that caused his blood to freeze despite his dwindling reserves of strength. More hoofbeats, rapidly approaching from behind. Pete Morrison had located reinforcements after all, and this time he wasn't arriving alone. Silas forced himself into a sitting position, his gun feeling heavy in his grip. Through the swirling dust cloud behind them, he could discern at least 6 riders. The Morrison gang wasn't solely motivated by his bounty any longer. They craved vengeance for Jake's betrayal, and they'd slaughter everyone within this wagon to satiate their bloodlust. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion, "we have company." She glanced back and immediately registered the approaching dust cloud. Her face paled visibly, yet her grip tightened on the reins, determination hardening her features. "How long before they overtake us?" Silas assessed the distance and the condition of their horses with a practiced eye. 10 minutes, perhaps less. Diego's breathing remained stable thanks to the medicine, but it would all be rendered inconsequential if they were all killed before reaching Millbrook. Miguel had spotted the riders as well. He spurred his horse closer to the wagon, his gun already drawn and ready. "We cannot outrun them," he stated, "not burdened with the wagon." Silas understood the implication. Someone would need to stay behind and buy time for the others to escape. And there was only one member of this group who was already teetering on the brink of death. But as the hoofbeats grew louder behind them, Silas realized he might not possess sufficient strength to ensure his final stand held any significance. The riders were closing the gap quickly, their horses fresh, while Elena's team was utterly exhausted from hauling the wagon across the unforgiving terrain. Silas could now make out Pete Morrison's face, twisted with rage and unwavering determination. The wounded outlaw had gathered every available gun for hire between here and the territory line. "Halt the wagon!" Silas commanded with surprising force. "What?" Elena's voice cracked with panic. "Stop it now. If we continue fleeing, they will intercept us in the open. At least here we have the wagon for some measure of cover." Miguel rode closer, his face grim. "You intend to make a stand? There are 6 of them and only 1 of you. If I am not much good in a gunfight, then do not fight," Silas said, struggling to dismount from the wagon bed. "Take Diego and flee. There is a wash approximately a quarter-mile to the north. Reach it and continue on towards Millbrook." Elena leapt down from the driver's seat and assisted in steadying him. "You can barely remain standing. How can you possibly contend with 6 armed men?" Silas checked his gun. 4 bullets remained. Hardly sufficient, but it would have to suffice. "I am not planning to win, merely planning to buy you some precious time." "No," Miguel stated firmly. "I will not allow another man to die for my family." "Your family?" Silas scrutinized the young father with a hint of respect creeping into his gaze. "Boy, you possess more backbone than your daddy ever did." The insult would have stung at any other moment, but Miguel merely offered a grim smile. "Papa always said that courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the capacity to act appropriately despite feeling afraid." The sound of approaching hoofbeats was close enough now to be felt reverberating through the ground. Diego stirred faintly in Elena's arms, his breathing relatively stable thanks to the medicine, yet he remained critically ill. "Elena," Silas said urgently, "take him and depart now." But Elena Vasquez had spent 2 long years meticulously planning her revenge, and she was not about to cower and run from Pete Morrison and his posse of hired guns. She retrieved her husband's ancient rifle from the wagon and checked its ammunition. "Carlos perished defending our family," she said quietly, a steely resolve hardening her features. "Perhaps it is time I followed suit." The 3 of them formed a defensive perimeter around the wagon as the riders thundered closer. Silas positioned behind the wagon bed, Miguel near the front wheel, and Elena crouched beside the water barrel, Diego cradled safely in her arms. The fate of the child's future rested on their ability to survive. Pete Morrison and his gang reined in their horses 50 yards away, maintaining a cautious distance beyond easy pistol range. They had learned to respect Silas's accuracy, even if they no longer felt intimidated by his diminished state. "Smart strategy," Pete shouted, a sneer curling his lips. "Cost me a fortune in bounty money. Time to pay what you owe. I have a bullet waiting for you." Silas surprised himself with how strong his voice sounded. 6 against 3, Pete laughed. "I like those odds." Where was Jake Morrison? That could be important information. "Where's your cousin, Pete?" Finally grow a conscience? Pete's face darkened. Jake made his choice. Now he's going to live with it or die with it. Tension rose. In Elena's arms, Diego made a soft sound, not distress, but something almost like contentment. The medicine was working, giving him the strength to fight a little longer. That tiny sound seemed to break something loose in the desert air. Pete Morrison drew his gun, and the shooting started. Silas's first shot took down the rider. His second shot went wide as pain flared. Miguel's shot missed completely, but Elena dropped a third man. 3 guns against 6 was still losing odds, and Silas felt his strength failing. Blood loss was making his vision blur, and his hands were starting to shake. Pete Morrison's return shot splintered wood. The next volley would probably be the last one he'd ever hear. Then, from the ridge came the sound of a rifle shot. One of Pete's men pitched forward, and chaos erupted. Jake Morrison had come back, and he'd brought friends. As the gang found themselves caught between 2 groups of shooters, Silas smiled. The gunfight was fierce but brief. When the dust settled, Pete Morrison lay face down, and his surviving men were riding hard for the horizon. Jake Morrison emerged from the rocks with 2 other men. "Told you this ain't over," Jake said, looking down at his cousin's body. "Guess I was wrong." Elena clutched Diego tighter as the baby's breathing remained steady. The medicine had bought them the time they needed, and now the path to Millbrook was clear. Silas felt his legs giving out and sat against the wagon wheel. His vision was getting darker, but Diego was alive. That had to count for something. "Miguel," he said weakly, "my saddlebags, get your boy to that doctor." As Miguel retrieved the money, Silas closed his eyes and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Peace. The desert sun climbed higher, but for the first time Silas Crow wasn't running from anything. He was where he needed to be, and that baby was going to live. So there you have it, a story of unlikely redemption, where a hardened gunslinger, facing his own demise, finds a reason to fight for something more than just survival. It's a reminder that even in the darkest corners of life, even in the most unlikely of people, there's always the potential for compassion, for sacrifice, and for hope. The desert can be a cruel place, but sometimes it's also where miracles can bloom. What did you think of Silas's journey? Did his transformation surprise you? What was your favorite moment in the story? I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, and interpretations in the comments below. Let's get a discussion going. And if you enjoyed this wild ride and want to delve into more stories that explore the depths of human nature, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future uploads. Until next time, thanks for watching.